we've had a biodiversity crisis as well. And anytime that we are reducing the potential genetic diversity or connectivity between habitats for different populations of species, we're going to be manipulating and playing with fire, pun intended here, as we perhaps further challenge the ability for our wildlife populations to be able to withstand and be resilient to things like climate change when we are reducing genetic variability and decreasing connectivity.
Welcome, wild ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, we're joined by Andrew Rothman. Andrew Rothman has spent 25 years working on wildlife conservation throughout the Americas. Andrew founded Rainforest Biodiversity Group to support the conservation of habitat for the endangered great green macaw in Costa Rica. Andrew spent 11 years as the Migratory Bird Program Director for American Bird Conservancy. And most recently, Andrew was the Wild Places Program Director with Wild Earth Guardians, watchdogging the management of public lands to protect and connect wildlife habitat across the American West. Welcome to the Green Root podcast, Andrew.
Hey, Josh, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, let's just launch into it by me asking you, what did we all do on Saturday?
Yeah, so Josh, myself, and a couple of other people put together a field trip to go into the Pike National Forest. There we were looking to bring people to see the area that is proposed for part of a project called the North-South Project. The Lower North-South Project. It's a proposed action by the Forest Service that includes potential logging of some 116,000 acres within about a 200,000 acre project area. And so we wanted to bring people out to the forest, in particular to look at some of the mature and old growth forests that this national forest holds, the importance of the forest for a number of wildlife species, and get really people to connect with the land, since this is an important project that is proposed not too far outside of Denver, right here in the Front Range of Colorado.
Yeah, it was a great hike. We had about 25 people out there, and Andrew was one of the hike leaders. We had Rocky Smith, he's a forest management analyst. We had David Niels, he's a predator expert, and we sort of split off a bit and then sometimes wound up together again to get different perspectives on this. And we walked through some old growth forest and talked about forest ecology, wildfire ecology. People seemed really into it. And more, I think it's the most important way to get people involved is to take people actually into the forests that are threatened so they can appreciate what we have and what might be lost if we don't take action. So what was your, let's just say, favorite part of the hike? What did you enjoy most about it?
I think that I just enjoyed the feedback that we got from folks. There was a lot of people that were fairly new to uh, activism. They were very unaware of some of the NEPA process, that's National Environmental Policy Act processes, in which people actually have the opportunity to get information on what agencies like Forest Service are proposing, and also to provide feedback. People were very unaware of the project in general, as well as the ability to have a say. So I think that, having the opportunity to educate people on that and get people interested in what the Forest Service is doing and knowing that they can participate in that process was rewarding.
Yeah, I thought it was great. My favorite part was I wasn't on the computer at all. I didn't have to be online. It was nice. I was like, why am I so calm and chill today? I'm like, oh, because I haven't been on the computer at all.
It was a beautiful
And
day.
yeah, it was great to get folks out there. And so this is part of an emergency authority action, which, not to get too much into the weeds, was under Section 40807 of an Infrastructure Act in 2021. So it was proposed under the Biden administration, a bipartisan bill, and this was snuck in there for emergency logging. Basically, the idea is if you say the word wildfire, we get to bypass aspects of NEPA. We can move forward these projects as quickly as possible because emergency, right? It's like yelling fire in a crowded building. So between 2021 and 2024-ish, 23, 24-ish, there were about 1 million acres placed under this emergency authorization, including this 116,000 acre. Under Trump administration, when he came in and he put out an executive order to increase timber production, about 2 weeks later, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is in charge of the U.S. Forest Service, said, oh, okay, well, I guess we're going to make our emergency logging from 1 million acres to 112 million acres. So that is 59% of national forest. That's pretty much the vast majority of national forest that can even be logged. A lot of it is unloggable anyway. And so this is not only important for the local area in Colorado west-wide, this is a national issue, a national concern. And yeah, I think that's just why this particular area is so important. And the last thing I'll say is we have been trying to get media coverage on this for over a year and a half. We actually did a hike last year, repeated press releases from different angles with different information. Not one media source has even mentioned what appears to be the largest logging project in at least modern Colorado history, certainly of the century. So I guess I would ask you, why do you suppose this is falling off of people's radar?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first of all, there's a lot of things on people's radar. Let's just recognize that, right? I think um, wildfire also is a very sensitive subject, of course, right? And in particular, when projects are proposed that are supposed to be projects that are going to help reduce wildfire, people automatically think that that's probably a good thing, which in some senses, the basic concept of it makes sense. I think that part of the problem is there's so much nuance as related to forest management and wildfire that it's hard for people to fully grasp what's good, what's right, what's problematic, and I think that that makes it hard for people to cover the subject. This particular project is part of what Forest Service calls their wildfire crisis strategy, and this was strategy developed under the Biden administration, under Secretary Vilsack. And while it's not the 150 million acres that's now under the emergency authorization under Trump, it did propose that there would be treating various landscapes, in particular across the West, and for a total of some 50 million acres. So the idea that we need to reduce fuels to save the forest is one that comes with a lot of baggage. The Forest Service itself has a long history of suppressing fire, which has increased some of the fuel loads in some places, reduced the ecological processes, including having regular fires on our national forests. And so the conditions have changed over time. And now the idea is that we're going to go in and we're going to cut a bunch of forest, and that's going to reduce the fuels, and somehow that's going to save the rest of the forest. I think as we talk about wildfire, what we're really trying to talk about is reducing wildfire impact on infrastructure, right? So we see fires and we see the damage that they do, and that damage is usually as related to, for the most part, human infrastructure. The issue with that as well is that even Forest Service science shows that the most effective way to reduce infrastructure from burning is by breeding areas within the first 100 feet of a given infrastructure. So that kind of contrasts with the idea that we need to go in and cut tens of thousands of acres, perhaps in the backcountry, where we're not talking about areas that are close to infrastructure. So that's a long way to say it's complicated, and some of that complication makes it hard to talk about with the public.
Yeah, well, we did have media out there last year, and he was really interested in the science, and we provided him with a lot of the studies that show cutting in the forest is either ineffective or counterproductive at protecting communities. Because, yeah, like you said, that's really what this is all about. The forest knows how to handle itself when it comes to a wildfire, all that. At the end of the day, but not technically that. A few weeks later, we're talking to him about it. He basically said, I'm not sure how to make sense of all of the conflicting science. So then he just didn't report on it at all, which
Right.
is like, okay, but the public should at least be able to know that a thing is happening,
Yeah.
and then they can weigh in or make their own decision. So it's a bit upsetting. We do have some media potentially interested this time, but we're putting the word out on our own. And something just to understand is, okay, well, if this is about community protection, right, which is really the thrust behind this, this is where they get all the money. They claim it's about in the forest, and whether you even agree with that or not, truly the aspect that is the primary drive is community protection. But this particular project, and I would say the vast majority, are not necessarily near homes. There are some parts of it that might be, but this is in roadless areas. So this is in Colorado roadless areas. So there's 18,500 acres in protected Colorado roadless areas. So the concept of a roadless area is not only is it not near homes, it's not even near roads. So do you feel like this is an example potentially of the exploitation of the concerns with wildfire to promote a particular agenda?
Well, it certainly could appear that way. And, um, I don't want to make an opinion on any one person or agency's rationale for doing something. But what we do know is certainly is that to make the math work for some of the non-commercial treatments that could be, hand thinning, reducing some fuels in the understory in certain areas, those are not money makers for companies. And unless they're going to be done with some kind of direct subsidy from the government, that kind of activity is oftentimes going to be hard to pay for. And so that's where um, contracting is going to require some income for the logging companies to get in there and do some of the non-commercial harvesting. And so that's where some of the commercial harvesting comes in, and the need to potentially take some bigger trees. And so how that all ties into this is certainly something to contemplate, as we know that there's lots of proposed actions here that include cutting of large trees, some 4,000 acres of mature and old growth forest. That forest is, of course, the most resilient to wildfire. Why we're going to go in and cut that kind of forest as part of this project is a bit of a head scratcher.
For sure. And some other details, this is clear cuts up to 40 acres in size. That's pretty large. And here are a couple of the areas that are within this project. So this part is called Rampart East. This is a roadless area. And so this was an analysis by the Forest Service claiming it's the largest and least human impacted area remaining in the Rampart Range, forms a critical core area for wildlife at the edge of the rapidly growing Interstate 25 urban corridor. And then another roadless area, so is Bear Creek portion, is a quote, near pristine example of a Colorado Front Range transition zone between montane and plains ecosystems. So what makes something a pristine transition zone, of course, is the tree growth, the vegetation, but it's also the wildlife. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the wildlife that is living in this area currently?
Sure. So there are four, actually five species of real conservation interest. Four of them are listed as threatened species on the endangered species list, and one that's been proposed. So those species include Canada lynx, Mexican spotted owl, Pawnee montane skipper, which is a butterfly, And then we have and I might get the name wrong, the three-toed bat.
I think it's
I
the
think
three-colored bat or something like tricolored bat.
tricolored bat. Yes, and then also the Preble's jumping mouse. And Preble's jumping mouse is a small mouse that's found usually in riparian habitat. And so, these are all species that are going to be impacted, and the biological analysis assessment rather that was done by Forest Service indicated that the actions of this project were likely to adversely affect at least the four species. I don't know if they had done the analysis on the bat yet in that biological assessment. And these are species that are going to be impacted, in particular the skipper and the Preble's jumping mouse, and somewhat the Mexican spotted owl are going to be impacted by proposed actions in riparian areas as well as areas on steep slopes. So if you have areas of steep slope logging, clearly there are going to be prone to runoff. That runoff is going to get into the riparian areas. Plus there's some 2,000 acres of riparian area proposed for treatment directly. So those are areas that potentially have habitat, including critical habitat for some of these species like the jumping mouse and the montane skipper. As for the Mexican spotted owl, that's a mature and old growth forest species. It requires high cover in terms of ground shade cover. It's a closed canopy species. The basal area coverage is at least 120 feet per acre, and the Forest Service is proposing to cut some of these forests down to say 30 or 40 feet per acre. So if they're going in and doing that kind of work in Mexican spotted owl habitat, well, they're certainly going to be destroying Mexican spotted owl habitat. And, it's a species that also needs big snags. Some 40+% of its habitat should be of trees greater than 12 inches DBH. So it needs large trees. It also needs a lot of down woody material because that's where its prey species are going to be found, whether it's wood rats or voles or other mice or even rabbits. The habitat that those prey species needs is what some foresters would consider fuel that needs to get removed. So there's a little bit of conflict there in terms of habitat needs and potential fuel loads, right? And then also the Canada lynx. The species has habitat 9,000 feet and above. It's a reintroduced species to Colorado, but it has established itself anew here. Much of the project's western portion would be in and around lynx critical habitat. And again, it's a species that is a species that lives in coniferous forest with lots of horizontal cover that provides habitat for its main prey species, the snowshoe hare. So high elevation species, dense coniferous forest, again, some of the areas that are proposed for treatment or logging in this project are going to affect lynx habitat.
Right. And I would say the trickiest part of this project and other projects like it is because it is all wrapped up around the idea that it is wildfire and it's emergency. And they'll kind of jump from topic to topic if you challenge them on one. If you say, well, we're not really believing that this is protecting communities. It's like, well, okay, but we need to protect the forest from burning. And it's like, well, not sure if that's a valid concern. Well, in that case, we have wildlife concerns and we have to create, so there's always kind of another jumping to another topic. And right now they're also saying, well, the forests are supposed to be a certain way. And then you show science that contests that. And they say, well, in the future, we're going to have to change the type because of climate change. So my concerns with this, and the reason why I and Eco Integrity Alliance keep focusing on this one note, is because I think this is simultaneously the largest threat in terms of landscape wide manipulation, destruction of ecosystems, while at the same time, the most, I'm going to say, is devious way of pushing through cutting. Because in the past, when they're saying we're doing a commercial logging sale, we're going to get some wood out of here, like it or not, this is what's happening. And then there was a toehold. You could say, well, do we really need this wood? Now they don't even make that as the argument. Their argument is like, well, do you want to burn up in a fire? Because if you do, you're a bad person. So that's what a lot of us are dealing with. This is why it's such a tricky topic to communicate to the public and elected officials, and why it's so easy to sort of demonize those who speak up on the topic. But do you feel like there is, whether you agree with that premise or not, do you feel like people are becoming more aware of the fact that it is a bit of a, how do I put this? The idea that the best way to deal with forests is in wildfires is always to cut forests out in the forest. Like, do you think that people are catching on more that that's not the best thing, or are people going further down that road, would you say?
I'll say both. And what I mean by that is that you do have more people becoming educated on the nuances of wildfire. I'm going to plug a colleague's film here, Elemental: Reimagining Wildfire by Ralph Bloomers. That that film recently, about a year ago, came out, and I think it does a great job of talking about the issue in a way that makes people understand that what's being proposed by the Forest Service is at the minimum controversial, and it allows people to make up their own mind about what should be done. But it presents the information of, the areas that we're proposing of cutting may not ever burn, or it could increase the likelihood that they burn. And it doesn't automatically mean that if you cut a particular area that you're quote unquote saving it. Again, if we're talking about infrastructure, then that's an infrastructure burning issue, not a forest fire wildfire issue. So I think that educational efforts, such as through that film and as through a number of advocates, and the number of people that are pushing back on this proposed legislation called the Fix Our Forest Act, there's a lot of people starting to understand that the idea that we're going to cut our forests to save them from fire is the right approach. But at the same time, on the flip side, and the reason why I say both is that you still have in particular legislators who feel like they have to do something, because if the next wildfire occurs on their watch, then they're going to feel as if people are going to hold them culpable. And there's a lot of people that are uneducated, and fire is a scary thing, and fire has damaged many communities. And because of this dynamism between fear of fire, realizing that it is a natural process, we're not going to stop wildfire from happening, like, period. And just the idea that we're going to really impact it. I think we need to even think about how we're going to be able to do that in an effective way. We don't have the money to do the potential logging that would stop wildfire. And then if we did, what would be the impacts of it on our ecosystems? What would it be the impacts on our water and our wildlife? And so, because of all of those complications, again, this is a complicated issue. And in short, I think there's more people that are becoming educated, but there's still a lot of people that aren't familiar with the nuances of this issue.
Yeah, that's a great analysis, I would say. And as climate heats up, because we had a pretty cool, comparatively cool and wet last century. So as climate heats up, which I believe is to do with at least primarily human caused climate change, we're seeing more fires. If you go back to before 1900s, early 1800s, there were also large fires. So the idea of a large fire, a severe wildfire being something new, that's not the case, but we're certainly seeing more of them than the past century, which I do think it can be attributed to climate change. And we have more homes that have been built in the fire plane. So it's kind of like when you build your home in a floodplain and then a flood comes in, I mean, it's going to happen. And there's
Shouldn't be
only so much
surprised.
right, right. There's only so much you can do. And maybe there was a drought for a while, like, oh, look, we're good. And it's like, well, now there's not a drought. But of course, it's the opposite because we are seeing more drought and all of these conditions that result in these larger wildfires that are more of a threat to community. But yeah, I think there's a lot to say on this, but I think what you said in terms of the elected officials not wanting these things to happen on their watch. So they just check a box and it's sort of plausible deniability. This is just my opinion that it doesn't really matter if they do the thing that works so long as they do a thing. And if you just say, look at all this public land, choppity, 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 chop, that's a thing you can point to. And then they can say, well, sorry, your home burned down. We tried, or those meddling enviros wouldn't let us cut all of the forest, and that's why it happens. But to me, it feels as if it's almost like anything but addressing the root causes. And I would say in this case, climate change, ecological destruction, and just endless growth. Colorado is a growth place. Like this is one of the places we're building more and more homes. So I live adjacent to national forest and they have logged it before. They want to log more of it. They want to bust roads through old growth forest. They want to all do all these things for wildfire. And then meanwhile, there's somebody building a 6,500 square foot McMansion pushing further into the fire plane. And it's like, how can we do both of these things at the same time? Somebody keeps creating more vulnerability, pushing further into the fire plane, and then we're supposed to do all these other pointless things, which I would say the scientific literature at best says are controversial and or of limited effectiveness. A lot of it also says actually this is counterproductive and can increase the drying out, heating up the microclimate, as well as increasing the spread of wind, which is what threatens homes. But so what do you think in terms of root causes? Do you feel like the Forest Service elected officials right now are really addressing the root causes on this or even
Well,
trying?
yeah, I mean, I think that you're right in that a clear root cause of increased frequency of high severity fire is climate change, right? We are clearly living in a time where we have hotter, drier conditions, and that, of course, dries out fuels, changes entire ecosystems, and so it's hard for the Forest Service or any particular legislator to effectively legislate climate change. But we certainly are not doing anything to reduce the subsidies for fossil fuel producers and those contributors to greenhouse gases and the things that are really continuing to heat up our planet. And so, while we want to put a band-aid on the thing that we can perhaps do something about, in this case, oh, well, if we reduce fuel, we're going to reduce fire. That might seem like doing something, but it seems that, to me, in my opinion, that's a bit of a placebo, and not effectively addressing the core issues that our society is facing through things like climate change. And so, going in and perhaps cutting and manipulating habitat for species that are on the endangered, threatened list. Also, further, while it might not jeopardize the entire population, and that's what Forest Service often, has as their limit. Is it going to jeopardize the entire population? We've had a biodiversity crisis as well. And anytime that we are reducing the potential genetic diversity or connectivity between habitats for different populations of species, we're going to be manipulating and playing with fire, pun intended here, as we perhaps further challenge the ability for our wildlife populations to be able to withstand and be resilient to things like climate change when we are reducing genetic variability and decreasing connectivity. So there are big things that we as a society are having to face, and right now, again, fear of fire is a big thing, and it's going to be clearly affecting the way that people think, and it is affecting the way that legislators are legislating, despite the fact that the real cause is based in the bigger things that we're doing to ourselves as a society, including continuing to spew carbon emissions into our atmosphere.
Sure. Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head. And I don't want to keep you too much longer, but a couple more pieces I wanted to address with you on this. So you mentioned the fear of fire, and I do think that that is really central in terms of people shutting off their rational thinking, because if you feel as if something is an existential threat, and fire is dangerous. I mean, the number of people who die, it's tragic, but it's not a huge number. There are ways to get out of the way of wildfire, and certainly nature knows how to get out of its own way in that regard. The animals know how to flee a fire for the most part. But the fire does instill fear. It's one of our most primitive, ancient fears. And I think our elected officials and I think a lot of other entities know how to push that button, because I'll be talking to somebody about, hey, they're planning to clear cut and they're planning to cut trees that are 100 years old or 200, over 200-year old growth trees. And like, that sounds terrible. That sounds terrible. And then I say, yeah, and they're claiming to do it for wildfire. And then I could see something shift in them. Like, well, I guess they have to. And it's like, don't let that shut off your thinking just because they're claiming a thing is an emergency. Sometimes an emergency is an emergency, and we can't just assume our government is always lying. I'm not one of those people who says that. But at the same time, one of the easiest ways to push through things that might not be great is to say, this will kill you if you don't do it. So do you feel as if there are any ways that we can, I don't want to say resist that, but how do we provide people with the information that can cut through that emotional response of just basically fear of death? Tough question.
Yeah, that's probably a complicated question. I think one of the things that I think about in particular, I was on a panel after the Elemental film was shown here in Denver. And I was on a panel, and I think he was with the gentleman from the Golden Fire Department. And, fire persons are firefighters are oftentimes the kind of people that people still have faith in and listen to and believe. And so I think that, those are the kind of people, if you don't want to listen to myself or Josh or people that you think that are, enviros and are one-sided, which I don't believe that we are. I think we're very much pro life. And in the sense of we want to see life on this planet continue, right? But talk to people that you trust, like firefighters, and when you hear from firefighters that um, we need to invest in community and home hardening, and then that there are loopholes through insurance agencies, through insurance companies. There are loopholes in the fire code. So when new buildings are built, they can get around having to spend money on things that would make a home less vulnerable to wildfire. These are places where we could invest dollars to reduce and the potential for a home ignition or infrastructure ignition. So, again, I think that people who are aware of and understand fire ignition, in particular infrastructure ignition, and some of the things that are happening that are not getting invested in, um, learn about that, and then also compare that to, okay, we're proposing to cut lots of acres away from infrastructure. We're going to be cutting trees that store carbon. And what are we just, question a little bit more of I think the agency's actions and if they're going to be truly effective. I think that some of the legislators want to do the right thing, but they also don't have the full information. Um, so, in conclusion there, I think that it's important for people to continue to educate themselves. Don't take it just from you or I. Take it from people who are both in the field of fire and wildfire as well as infrastructure fire, and have that conversation in your own head about like, well, what would be the most effective strategy to continue to have our forests and wildlife protected and carbon stored in the trees while also reducing the potential for ignition. And, when in my own mind, as I kind of contemplate this equation, um, you know, I do think of the Lorax and the idea that like we're cutting these trees. Are we really saving the trees if we're cutting the trees? Um, and if this is a infrastructure issue, why are we focusing our investment in dollars and resources into treating fuels that are far from infrastructure?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that says it all. And in terms of this lower north south project, which is a part of this larger emergency action, which I've been keeping track of all of the emergency action stuff on a spreadsheet up to 1 million acres. And now, I mean, now that it's just these broad swath, it's sort of a moot point. But if you're listening to this and you're living in the West or the United States, frankly, this is your issue. This is likely coming to a national forest near you. It's probably also coming to a state forest and county open space and even municipal mountain park near you. But we're trying to get Congress to speak out, certain members of Congress to speak out about this in Colorado and make it both a local, regional, and national issue, tying into the whole thing. Because my take is right now, the only way that we'd be taking climate change and ecological concerns seriously is by protecting the lands that are supposed to already be protected. In my mind, those are public lands. So if we're going to meet any sort of responsibilities under what's known as the Global Biodiversity Framework or any sort of international agreements for climate change, protecting our lands is the best way to do it. And unfortunately, not only haven't we been protecting the lands, we are now in the process of unprotecting greater swaths than we've ever seen. So yes, people are concerned about potential sell-off of public lands for private, but what is far more likely is keeping it public and just removing the democratic and scientific process, and they're just going to be cutting them in our name with our tax dollars and saying that they're doing us a favor in the process. So I guess, do you have any last thoughts on the topic, the project, the concepts behind all of this forest degradation?
Like, well, I think more to this particular project, I contacted Representative Peterson's office, and they seem to be unaware of the project. And this project runs right along the county line between Douglas and Jefferson County, and I think that's also the border between Peterson's district and Gabe Evans' district. And so both of them probably have very little input right now and understanding of the project. And so I think it's important that the public contact them to make them aware of this project. It's very unlikely that this project is going to be stopped just simply through the NEPA process. It could be perhaps slowed with litigation if the set of facts proves that they perhaps are in violation of the Endangered Species Act or NEPA, or NIFMA for that matter. But congressional involvement and scrutiny could put a little bit more pressure on the Forest Service to have a different outcome for this project. We're still waiting on the final decision. So it hasn't been approved yet. We expect that it will at some point this year. So it's worthwhile to visit the Pike San Isabel National Forest website and look up for this project under projects called the Lower North South. Educate yourself on it. Contact your representatives about it, and also you can still try to communicate with the Forest Service. It's outside of official comment period, and and may not have a lot of influence, but I think the more that we speak with a voice as a whole and together and make noise about this project, the more scrutiny that it's going to get. And we want to have the best possible outcome for this proposed action. And I think, again, the more people that are contributing to make that better, the better outcome we can have.
Amen. And if you're listening to this, certainly taking action, you can go to eco-integrity.org, and we have all sorts of info there, coloradosmokescreen.org, and spread the word, spread this podcast, because right now, I hate to say it, but media has chosen not to alert the public on this. So whatever the reasons are behind that, we've got some problems in terms of we can't engage in democracy if we're not aware of things that are happening. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what Andrew is doing. And if you're a listener or viewer of the Green Root podcast, that's you too. So hope you can all be a part of this. And Andrew, again, thank you so much. If there is a way that you want people to get in contact with you or find out more about what you have been working on, what would that way be?
Probably the easiest way right now is just through Instagram. So I'm at a.rothman on Instagram. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. Shoot me a message there, follow me there, and happy to provide more information and connect directly.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on the Green Root podcast, and thank you for all your work over the years. And yeah, let's keep fighting the good fight and advocating for nature.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Appreciate it.